I was raised in a scientific household, a very materialistic household. My father was a chemist whose world was defined by the periodic table of the elements, and we just never talked about anything spiritual in our household. It's not that we were opposed to spiritual things; it just never occurred to us to bring them up. The physical world was all we knew, and as far as we could tell, when you died, that was the end, and that was fine with me. That's just the way things were. So I went through college and medical school with that materialistic mindset, and then started to become a psychiatrist with the idea of trying to figure out how the brain creates our thoughts and our feelings and moderates those things. And then in the first few weeks of my psychiatric training, I was asked to evaluate a patient in the emergency room who had overdosed. Uh, Now, I was in the cafeteria eating dinner when the page came off, and it buzzed on my belt, and I was startled and dropped my fork and actually splashed some spaghetti sauce on my tie. I quickly tried to wipe it off unsuccessfully, so I decided to just put on a lab coat, a white lab coat, and cover it up, button it up so you wouldn't see the stain. I was a green intern. I didn't want people to think I was unprofessional. So I went down to the emergency room to see this patient, and she was totally unconscious. I could not arouse her no matter what I did. So I heard that her roommate, who had brought her into the emergency room, was waiting to see me in a room down the hall. So I went down the hall, talked to the roommate, got background information, what was going on in the patient's life, what the stressors were, what she might have taken, and so forth. It was a very hot evening in late Virginia summer, and there was no air conditioning in those days. So I unbuttoned my lab coat so I wouldn't sweat so much, and unknowingly then exposed the stain on my tie for a few minutes. When I finished talking to her in about 15 minutes, I got up to let her go, saw the stain, and quickly buttoned my coat up again and said goodbye to her, sent her home, and then went back to see the patient. She was still unconscious. So she was admitted to the intensive care unit overnight because she had irregular heartbeats. And I arranged to come see her in the morning after she awoke. Well, when I came the next day, she was very groggy, could barely open her eyes. I started by introducing myself, and she said, "I know who you are. I remember you from last night." Well, that kind of stunned me because I was pretty sure she couldn't see me. So I said, "I'm surprised at that. I thought you were unconscious when I talked to you last night." And then she looked me in the eye for the first time and said, "Not in my room. I saw you talking to my roommate." Well, that just blew me away. I couldn't imagine how that could be. She could only have known about that if she had followed me down the hall, left her body and followed me down the hall. And that clearly was impossible. As far as I could tell, I was my body. How can you leave it? She sensed my confusion and then started to tell me about the conversation I had with her roommate. When I asked her what the roommate said, where we were sitting, what we were wearing, and finally she told me about seeing the spaghetti stain on my tie. I just couldn't make any sense of that. However, I couldn't deal with my confusion. I was there to help her. So I kind of stuffed my feelings aside and tried to get back to her and talk with her about her suicidal thoughts and what stresses there were and so forth. As I processed this over the next few days, I just couldn't make any sense of it at all. I tried to tell myself that somebody was playing a trick on me, either the patient and the nursing staff. They colluded somehow. I just couldn't imagine how it could be. But I tried to stuff it out of my mind. I just couldn't make any. I didn't dare tell anyone else about it. I'm sure they would think I was crazy or gullible, so I just didn't talk about it. And it was several years later, in 1975, that Raymond Moody published a book called Life After Life, in which he gave us the term near-death experience and described what these near-death experiences, or NDEs, were like. And as it happened, around the same time, he started his training at the University of Virginia under my supervision. So I read his book and talked to them about that and realized for the first time that this incident my patient had told me about years earlier was not just one isolated event, but part of a worldwide phenomenon that millions of people were talking about. I still couldn't understand it. And yet, as a scientist, I couldn't just turn my back on it and say, these things aren't happening. They clearly were. So I thought it was my responsibility to study them, try to understand them. At the time, I thought there must be some simple brain mechanism for this. And that was my intent when I started studying them. And now here I am 50 years later, still trying to understand them. Shortly after Moody wrote his book, he was contacted by several other people who wanted to study NDEs. And he gathered them all together at the University of Virginia, where we were. And out of that group, we formed an organization that eventually became the International Association for Near-Death Studies, or IANS. And this was a group mostly at first to support the near-death experiencers who were isolated in different places trying to study this phenomenon. And later it became more and more a group to support the near-death experiencers themselves who were having trouble getting back to a, quote, normal life after the NDE. I eventually moved to the University of Connecticut, where Ken Ring was studying near-death experiences. I ended up editing the Journal of Near-Death Studies for 27 years. We started many support groups for near-death experiences around the country. And we eventually started having annual conferences of the International Association for Near-Death Studies. And gradually, over the next decades, I come to appreciate more and more how common these NDEs are and how important they are, not only for the experiences themselves, but for our understanding of what it is to be human.